This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, events, and locations are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. "Sit beside him," Clara said. Her fan snapped open with the particular precision of a woman who had never in her life been afraid of anything. "I dare you." Harriet Thornton looked across the length of Lady Ashford's dining room at the Duke of Halcourt. He sat at the far end of the long table, alone, with an empty chair on either side of him, not by accident. She had been watching over the past hour, as the other guests arranged themselves with an instinct so collective it appeared almost choreographed, drifting subtly toward the opposite end of the table, finding reasons to relocate, to change seats, to discover a sudden preference for the chair nearest to the fire. The Duke had not moved, he had not looked up. He sat with his right hand below the table and his eyes on the wineglass in front of him, which he had not touched. "They say he ruined Lord Pemberton completely," Harriet said. She kept her voice low. "Not just his estate, the man himself, not a creditor, not a friend, nothing left. They say many things." Rosalind, pressed against Clara's elbow, was covering her mouth with her gloved fingers to contain what would otherwise be audible laughter. "They say he once made a woman faint, simply by looking at her." "I am not going to faint," Harriet said. "Then go." Clara's smile was bright and merciless. "Go sit beside him, or admit that you are afraid and give me your amber earrings." Harriet Thornton felt no fear. That was the core of it, she supposed. She should have been afraid. The whole room was afraid of him. Lady Ashford had gone visibly pale when he arrived without announcement that morning, with only a single manservant and no luggage beyond what a man might carry for a single night. She had recovered and smiled and said delighted, delighted, but her hands had been trembling slightly as she directed the footman. The other guests had taken their cue, and now here he sat at the end of the table, like a man who had made a permanent decision about solitude, and the whole of polite society was honoring that decision with notable enthusiasm. Harriet stood up. She crossed the dining room. She sat down in the empty chair to his right. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of deep harbor water in winter, not quite blue, not quite grey, shifting with the movement of the candlelight. Storm blue. She had never seen that precise color in a person's eyes before, and she noticed it the way she noticed all things that did not fit their expected category, with immediate attention. She said, "I am Harriet Thornton. My father is Sir George Thornton of Derbyshire. I am quite certain you do not know his name." A pause, a very careful pause. "I do not," he said. "That is entirely fine," she said, shaking out her napkin. "I am sitting here because my sisters dared me to. I thought I should tell you that immediately rather than let you wonder about my reasons." Another pause. Longer. She had the impression of being assessed, not as a woman is typically assessed in a dining room, for her dress or her complexion or the quality of her family connections, but as a stranger is assessed by someone who has learned to treat unfamiliar things with extreme care. He was deciding what she was, she thought, what category she belonged to. He said, "Most people find other means of amusing themselves." "Most people," she replied, "have spent 2 evenings watching you eat alone. It seemed unkind." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. It was barely even the ghost of one, caught and suppressed before it could become itself. But she saw it. He picked up his wineglass and drank. She noted this. She had been quite certain, for the last 40 minutes, that he had not drunk from it once. "Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. The city, the hour. Are you home or somewhere unexpected?" I read everyone. Harriet Thornton had always been the middle daughter, and she had made her peace with this early. Not the eldest, who moved through the world with the beautiful certainty of a woman who had never once doubted her own reception. Not the youngest, who laughed at everything and collected admirers the way other women collected ribbons, effortlessly, without particular intention, simply by being present and warm and easy. Harriet occupied the middle ground in the most literal sense, the sister who read too much, who kept a cabinet of pressed botanical specimens arranged in taxonomic order in her bedroom, who could discourse at length on the medicinal properties of 43 different plants, but reliably forgot which curtsy was owed to which rank. She was 26. She had declined 2 proposals on the grounds that she had found both men fundamentally uninteresting. Her mother regarded this as a slow domestic catastrophe. Harriet regarded it as a perfectly rational allocation of her attention. She had come to Ashford Hall because Clara had insisted, and because Lady Ashford's east garden was reputed to contain a late-blooming specimen of wild digitalis. She had been wanting to document before winter closed it. She had packed her sketchbook, her pressing boards, her small knife, and a notebook of annotated observations, and she had resigned herself to the dinners and the card evenings and the particular kind of conversation that happened in country houses when the rain came. She had not, in her calculations, included the Duke of Halcourt. He had arrived the second morning, announced by the sound of a single carriage on the gravel drive and the immediate collective stiffening of every person visible from the drawing-room windows. Lady Ashford had gone to meet him in the entrance hall. Harriet, who had been on her way from the library to the garden, had passed the hall just as he came through the door, and she had stopped, without meaning to, at the top of the stairs. He was tall and lean in the manner of a man who had once been broader, the kind of leanness that spoke not of constitution, but of time, as though something had been drawn out of him over the course of years and not replaced. He moved with a studied economy she found immediately interesting. He touched nothing unnecessarily. His gaze made one comprehensive sweep of the space before settling into neutrality, and when Lady Ashford extended her hand, he took it with his left, not his right. She noted this. She filed it away. By dinner that second evening, the pattern was established. He sat alone. He spoke only when addressed directly, in sentences of remarkable brevity. He left the table before the port was brought out, and the room seemed, after his departure, to exhale. Now Harriet sat beside him, and dinner continued, and she found that close proximity confirmed what she had suspected from across the room. He was not what they said he was. She could not have articulated this precisely. It was the accumulation of small observations, the kind she applied to botanical specimens without ever deciding to, the kind that built into a picture before she had consciously started assembling it. The way he held his fork was careful, not aggressive. The way he listened, and he did listen with his whole body even when he appeared not to, was the listening of a person who understood the weight of information. The way he answered her questions, when he answered them at all, was scrupulously accurate. He did not embellish, he did not perform, he did not. When she told him about the digitalis she had found by the east wall, the unusual persistence of the specimen past its season, the deepening of the bellflower color toward violet at the center, he listened with more attention than the subject seemed to warrant. He asked, "What are its uses?" Medicinally, it regulates the heart's rhythm. It has been employed in cases of cardiac dropsy, a congestion of the lungs, in carefully calculated doses. The timing is critical. She paused. In larger quantities, it is a poison. He looked at her for a moment that extended past the conversational requirement. "You know a great deal about it," he said. "I know a great deal about most plants," she replied. "It is something of an occupation." He said very quietly, "A useful one." There was a weight to the word useful that she could not account for. She turned it over in her mind later, sitting at the dressing table in her room, while her maid unpinned her hair, and she could not decide what he had meant by it. Only that he had meant something. She thought about his hands. He had kept his right below the table for most of dinner, and when he had finally reached for his glass, she had seen it clearly in the candlelight. A tremor in the fingers, fine and persistent, the kind that did not speak of nerves but of something structural, something that had been done to the hand, not born in it. She told herself it was none of her business. She lay in the dark for an hour, awake. The snow came in the night without warning. Harriet woke to the peculiar silence of a landscape that has had its sounds pressed flat under a weight of white, and she went to the window and saw that the garden had been erased. Every path was gone. The ornamental fountain was a smooth, irregular mound. The hedges had become soft, approximate shapes, vaguely recognizable if you already knew what they were. She dressed before anyone else in the house was awake, choosing her practical wool walking dress and her warmest boots, managing the pins herself by feel, and she went down through the kitchen passage because the servants' stairs did not creak. The scullery door opened quietly. She stepped out into the cold. The air struck her face like a hand, sharp, clean, carrying the mineral edge of new snow, and beneath it the damp smell of turned earth from the kitchen beds where the gardeners had been working before the weather turned. The sky was the color of pewter, just beginning to warm at the edges, and the light was the diffuse, directionless light of early morning in winter, which made everything look simultaneously close and very far away. He was there. The Duke of Halcourt stood in the center of the kitchen garden without his coat, in his shirt and waistcoat, his breath clouding in the cold air. His head was tilted back slightly. His eyes were closed. She stopped. The snow held the sound of her steps entirely, and yet he heard her, or perhaps felt her, registered the change in the weight of the air around him, because he turned with a quickness that was not startled, but prepared. The automatic response of a man whose body had been trained to know what was near it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Without the candlelight, without the social architecture of the dining room, his face was different. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she had understood them to be, deeper than his age warranted, and his age could not be more than 34, perhaps 35. The pallor she had taken, in the softer light of the previous evening, for a natural coloring was now visible for what it was. The pallor of sustained effort, of a man who had been working against something for a very long time and was feeling the full weight of it this morning, in the cold and the quiet, when there was no one to manage the impression he made. She said, because it was the first thing she thought, "You will catch your death." Something moved across his face. Not humor, not pain. Something in the narrow region between them, a response that acknowledged both and claimed neither. He said, "Very likely." She crossed the garden to him. He did not step back. The snow made no sound under her boots, and the silence between them was the silence of a space that had become, in a few steps, unexpectedly close. She was near enough now to see the texture of his shirt collar, the faint mark of old ink on his left index finger, the way the cold had put color into the ridge of his cheekbones. She said, "How long have you been out here?" "I do not sleep well. Many people do not sleep well. They generally choose warmer methods of managing it. I came out for the quiet." His voice was measured, careful, not unfriendly. "The house makes sounds," she said. "My bedroom has a board near the window that speaks whenever the temperature drops below a certain point. I have named it." He looked at her. She thought she detected the faintest shift in his expression, something that in a different man, at a different time, might have become a proper smile. He said, "What have you named it?" "Something uncharitable," she said. "It is not important." He breathed out. It was not quite a laugh. It was lighter than his speaking voice, a small release, the sound a man makes when something catches him off guard, and he does not quite have time to suppress it. She noticed it the way she noticed the wine glass the previous evening. She stored it. She said, "Your hand." His right hand hanging at his side was trembling visibly, more visibly than the previous evening. The cold had stripped away whatever he had been doing to manage it. He looked down at it. His jaw tightened. He did not pull it behind him, did not close it into a fist or push it into his waistcoat pocket. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has stopped fighting a particular battle and is simply living with the terms of the surrender. He said, "An injury." "From what?" She kept her voice entirely even, as she kept it even when she was examining something she did not yet understand, so as not to startle it. "From a long time ago." She looked at the hand. The tremor was fine and constant, and worsened slightly with each gust of wind from the east. She had read in one of her father's medical texts about tremors of this character, their patterns, their causes, their distributions across the hand. This one was concentrated in the 3 outer fingers. That was specific. It spoke to something specific. She said, "The cold makes it worse." "Yes. And certain other things, I expect." He looked up at her. She held his gaze. She was not looking at him with pity. She felt the precise, alert interest of a person who has encountered a problem whose dimensions she does not yet know, and wants to. She thought perhaps he could tell the difference, because the readiness in his posture, the prepared stillness she had noticed when he first turned, eased fractionally as she looked at him. She said, "Come inside. I will make tea. The kitchens will be empty for another hour." He considered this. She had the impression of a man examining the proposal from all sides, looking for the place where it became dangerous or complicated or something other than what it appeared to be on its surface. He seemed, in the end, unable to locate that place. He came. They sat at the long kitchen table, which smelled of yesterday's bread and the particular woody smell of a hearth that had been lit and banked and lit again for 20 years. She made tea from what was on the shelf, a decent bohea, not the best, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and she watched, with a quiet that she hoped did not appear as observance but probably did, as the tremor in his right hand slowed, then stilled. The warmth was managing it. "Good," he said after they had sat in silence long enough that it had become comfortable. "I purchased Ashford Hall from Lady Ashford's brother 3 years ago. I allow the family to continue the party as a condition of the sale." She poured her own cup. "An unusual arrangement. The family is attached to the house. The house is too large for my purposes." He paused. It seemed a reasonable solution. She said, "What are your purposes for a house?" He looked at her. He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she appreciated. He said, "I require somewhere to work, somewhere that is not London, a good library and access to a post road." "And you do not require the house itself?" "No," he said, "I do not require the house itself." She heard this, not the words but what sat under them. The same quality she had heard in everything he said. A man who had organized his life into what was functionally necessary and removed very deliberately everything that might become an attachment. She said, "You play chess." He looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "Looked. I saw you yesterday in the library. You were looking at the board in the cabinet. You were not looking at the books." She paused. "Would you play with me? This morning, when the house wakes up and there is nothing to do because of the snow, would you play?" Another silence. Longer. He said at last, "I warn you that I'm not an easy opponent." "I do not play chess for ease," she said. "My father taught me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He checked his watch before they went back inside. A pocket watch, old. The case worn at the edges with the smooth softness of handling rather than age. He held it in his left hand, not his right. The case stayed closed. He looked at the outside of it for just a moment, with an expression she could not fully read, and put it back. She said nothing. She thought, "There is something inside that watch he does not want anyone to see." She thought, "I will find out what it is." The snow confined the household for 2 full days. Lady Ashford managed the situation with the skill of a military commander with a well-stocked supply line, deploying fires and mulled wine and a rotating schedule of indoor entertainments with an efficiency that said she had planned for this eventuality. There were card games in the drawing room. There were charades. There was a reading circle that attracted 5 women and 1 elderly colonel who fell asleep in the 3rd paragraph. Harriet used the time to press the specimens she had already collected, to write up her observations in the notebook she kept locked in her travelling case, and to think at length about Dorian Halcourt. She encountered him 3 times in those 2 days. In the library, where she had found him standing at the window with a book he was demonstrably not reading. At the dinner table, where she sat beside him again without being dared, and he had not looked surprised, which she suspected meant he had at some point anticipated it. And in the corridor outside the conservatory, in the early afternoon, where they had very nearly collided at a turning, and he had caught her elbow to steady her, one hand his left, and the contact was so brief it was over, before she had properly registered it. But for that brief moment, she had felt the warmth of his hand through the wool of her sleeve, and the grip of it, careful, precise, the grip of a man who does not grab, but holds. They played chess as agreed in the library. She had set up the board, and he had sat down across from her and examined the placement of the pieces, the way a man examines a document he is not sure he should have been given. He played with his left hand. She had expected this. She had seen him do it unconsciously the previous evening, when he reached for his cup. But to watch it in the slower, more deliberate context of chess, to watch him make the adaptations she could see he had trained himself to make, the compensations built into muscle memory over what must have been months of practice. This was something else. It told her how long he had been managing this, how seriously he had taken the management of it. They reached a stalemate after 40 minutes. She considered this a genuine achievement. He seemed to consider it something different. Relief, she thought. The relief of someone who has been met at their level and finds it a more unfamiliar sensation than they expected. He said, "You play seriously." "My father taught me," she said. "He did not teach me to play for entertainment." "What did he teach you to play for?" "To think clearly." She moved her bishop. He said it was the one game that penalized wishful thinking. He looked at the board for a moment. He said, "I was taught by my brother." And then he stopped. She saw it happen. The words landed, and he heard them, and something in his face tightened. The careful blankness reasserting itself over an expression she had almost seen. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was a skill she had developed in gardens where patience was the difference between a poor specimen and a perfect one. He said after a moment, "He is gone now." She said, "I am sorry." Simply, without decoration, because she meant it. He inclined his head. He did not say anything more about his brother, but she saw his right hand move to his coat pocket, a small automatic movement, the fingers pressing against the shape of something inside, the shape of the watch. And then he pulled the hand back and set it flat on the table, and the tremor had begun again from the movement. She looked at the hand. She said very quietly, "May I ask what is inscribed in the watch?" He looked up. His storm blue eyes sharpened. "How do you know there is an inscription?" "The way you keep the case closed. When a man checks a watch, he opens it. He wants the time. When he does not open it, he is not seeking the time." She paused. "You check it every 20 minutes. You have not opened it once." A silence. It extended across the board, past the chess pieces, into the winter afternoon that was softening toward grey at the window. He said, "To my better half." R.H. She repeated it softly. Rach. Richard Halcourt. His voice was perfectly level. The levelness cost him something. She could hear the cost of it, the particular compression of a man who has become very skilled at spending energy to appear as though he is spending none. "My brother." She looked at him. She looked at the way he held himself, very straight, the careful posture of a man carrying something fragile, sitting in such a way that the weight of it was balanced precisely, because to shift would be to risk dropping it. She looked at his hands, the right one with its tremor and the left one perfectly steady, and she thought, he has been carrying this alone for years. And he has arranged his entire life around the carrying of it, the management of it, the maintenance of the appearance that it does not exist. She said, "I know something about foxglove and cardiac tremor that I did not tell you at dinner." He waited. "The tremor can be treated," she said. "Not cured. The underlying damage is what it is, but managed. A very precise dose of digitalis, timed correctly, can regulate the irregular impulses that cause it." She paused. "I would need to measure carefully. The margin between therapeutic and harmful is narrow, and it varies by constitution. But I have done it before, for a man in my village who had a similar presentation." He was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen on him, the expression of a man who has heard something he had stopped believing he would hear, something that suggested possibility where he had mapped only its absence. He said, "You are telling me this why?" "Because," she said, "you have been managing without information that might have been useful to you, and I dislike the waste of that." He looked at the board. His left hand was motionless on the table. His right hand, she noticed, had stilled somewhat. She did not know whether it was the warmth of the room, or the attention he was giving the conversation, or something physiological she could not account for, but it was stiller than before. He said at last, "I believe you are about to put me in check." "Yes," she said. She moved her queen. "I am." He looked at the board for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He said, "Miss Thornton, are you always this forthcoming with strangers?" She considered this honestly. "No," she said. "You are not very much like a stranger." He did not answer. But he looked at her for a moment longer than the chess required, and what she saw in those storm-blue eyes, under the control, under the careful management, was a kind of recognition she did not have a precise word for. The recognition of one particular kind of person by another. On the morning of the third day, the snow began to release at the edges. Channels of dark earth appeared along the south-facing wall of the kitchen garden. Footprints from the household staff became possible for the first time in 2 days, and the mood of the house shifted accordingly. The particular restlessness of people who have been confined and are beginning to calculate how soon they will not be. Harriet went to the library to find a botanical reference she had seen on the second shelf during her first exploration of the house. She was thinking about the digitalis, about the dosage she had administered to old Mr. Crane in the village, about whether the calculation would need to be adjusted for a man of Dorian's weight and constitution, and she went through the library door with her mind arranged entirely on this problem. There was a man behind the writing desk. He was dressed in footman's livery, the colors correct, the details correct, but the fit wrong. The coat was too tight across the shoulders. The posture was wrong in a way she would not have noticed if she had not been paying a particular kind of attention. He had his hands inside a leather portfolio that sat open on the desk, and the portfolio bore a wax seal on its flap that she recognized, a crest she had seen 2 days ago, pressed into a note that Dorian's manservant had delivered to the table before dinner. She stopped. The man's hands stopped moving inside the portfolio. She said, "That does not belong to you." He turned. He was perhaps 40, broad across the face with the flat and watchful eyes of a man who made calculations rather than expressions. He assessed her in a moment. She felt it, the rapid inventory, the categorization. She thought, he is deciding whether I am a complication. And then she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, I have been assessed by a dangerous man. I know this because I have no other word for the feeling. He said, "My apologies, ma'am. Wrong room." He left. She stood in the library until the sound of his footsteps had faded entirely. Then she crossed to the writing desk. The portfolio had been opened, the seal broken with care rather than force, the kind of break that spoke of practice, someone who had done this many times and did not want it to show. 2 letters inside had been disturbed. She could see it in the fold lines, the slight misalignment of paper that had been refolded by hands other than those that had folded it first. She did not read the letters. She left the room and found Dorian in the entrance hall, speaking briefly with his manservant. She said, without any preliminary, "There was a man in the library going through your correspondence. He was dressed as a footman, but he was not a footman. He had opened your portfolio." His face changed. She saw it, the speed of it, the absence of the careful modulation he applied to everything else. His eyes went past her to the library door, back to her face, and she saw in them the thing she had been watching for, without knowing she was watching for it, the response of a man who has not been surprised but who has had a fear confirmed. He said, "Describe him." She did. She described him with the precision she gave to specimens, height, build, the specific quality of his eyes, the wrong fit of his coat, the callus she had noticed on his right hand at the thumb and forefinger, the kind made by repetitive use of a particular tool. Dorian listened without interrupting. She had the impression of information being placed into a structure already built to receive it. He said, "Did he take anything?" 2 letters were disturbed. "I did not read them, and I do not know whether anything was removed." "No, of course you did not." He looked at her, and the quality of the look was different from any he had given her before. Not assessment, not caution, but something that acknowledged directly who she was and what she had done. He said, "How did you notice the fold lines?" "I notice things," she said. "It is a habit I have not been able to break." He was quiet for a moment. The entrance hall was empty. The other guests were at breakfast or still in their rooms, and the footmen had not yet begun their morning circuit. The quiet between them was specific and weighted. He said, "His name is Aldous Crewe, or he serves Aldous Crewe, which amounts to the same thing." He paused. "There are people who believe my brother is alive." She said, "Is he?" The pause that followed was the longest she had seen from him. He said, "Come with me." He took her to the small private sitting room at the back of the house. The one Lady Ashford had offered him for his exclusive use, with the understanding that a man who brought your family home and allowed you to continue hosting your annual party in it had earned a certain degree of accommodation. He closed the door. He told her, not all of it, she understood as he spoke, that there were rooms in this account he was not yet opening to her, dimensions whose existence she could sense in the gaps between sentences, but the shape of it. Richard Halcourt, officially recorded as deceased of fever in 1811, was alive and in hiding in Cumberland. He had survived. The fever, the official report, the record, all of it had been arranged by Dorian at considerable personal cost to protect his brother from the man who intended to ensure the death became real. That man was Lord Crewe, and Lord Crewe's agent had just been in the library. She said, "What does Crewe want?" "What?" Richard possessed evidence of something Crewe could not afford to have known. Dorian's voice was very flat. Evidence of acts that would have destroyed him entirely. Crewe needed Richard gone, and needed the evidence gone with him. "And you have been protecting Richard while building a legal case against Crewe?" He looked at her. "Yes." And the agent in the library was looking for Richard's location. He was looking for correspondence that might indicate it. The correspondence does not contain it. A pause. But he does not know that, she thought. She sat with the whole of it, the brother alive in the north, the legal machinery built in silence over 5 years, the man in the library who had the flat eyes of a man who worked outside the categories of law or scruple. She thought about Dorian alone at the end of a dining room table, keeping a watch with an inscription closed in his coat pocket, managing a tremor in one hand while he played chess with the other. She said, "The roads will be passable tomorrow." "Yes." Crewe's agent will report what he found, or what he did not find, and Crewe will recalculate. "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "You need to leave." He said, "I had planned to leave in the morning." She said, "I am coming with you." He said carefully, "That is not a thing I can ask." She said, "You did not ask." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man in the process of locating a reasonable objection and finding each time that she had already considered and dismissed it. He said, "Your sisters will form conclusions." "My sisters form conclusions about me regularly. I have been surviving their conclusions since I was 14. She paused. "My aunt lives near Penrith. I had already planned to visit before returning to Derbyshire. I had only delayed because of the snow." This was true. It was also true that she had not, in fact, finalized the plan before this moment. But the visit was something she had genuinely been intending, and the distinction seemed, under the circumstances, minor. He said, "The road passes through exposed country above the valley." "I know it," she said. "I have taken it 4 times, once in worse conditions than this." He was quiet. The fire in the small sitting room had burned down to coals that glowed dull orange in the grate, and the morning light coming through the window was the pale, flat light of a day that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. He said, "I will speak to your maid about the chaperone arrangement." She understood this as agreement. She said, "I will be ready before first light." They left at 5:30 in the morning, before the house was fully awake, before breakfast, before anyone would have reason to notice a departure or question it. The air was cold and still in the way that follows snow, when the world has been stilled and has not yet remembered to move again. Their breath made clouds against the dark. The carriage rolled quietly on the softened road. For the first 2 miles they did not speak. She did not mind this. She was watching the road and the hills and the way the light was beginning at the eastern edge, a grey brightening that would become, in an hour, the pale gold of a winter morning. He was watching something she could not see. She had the impression of him listening, the way she had seen him listen at the dining table, with the whole body, attention spread evenly outward. She said at the 3rd mile, "Before you were the Duke, what were you?" He turned to look at her. He said, "That is a precise question." "I have been thinking," she said, "about the way you manage information, the way you assessed me when I sat beside you at dinner, and again when I came out to the garden, and again when I described the man in the library to you. It is the assessment of someone who has been trained to do it, not someone who learned it from experience." He was quiet. She said, "You worked for the government." A longer quiet. "Informally," he said at last, "for approximately 4 years. The work involved risk. Most useful work does." "And the tremor," she said, "is it from that?" He looked out the window. The hills were coming clear now in the growing light, the curves of them steady and grey-green against a lighter grey sky. He said, "There was an incident. In 1809. He paused. "The nerves in my right hand were damaged. The tremor is what remained after the rest healed." She said, "I have the digitalis. I prepared a dose this morning before we left." She reached into her coat pocket and found the paper she had folded and tucked there at 5 in the morning by the light of a single candle, working from memory and her notebooks and the careful calculations she had made over 2 days. "The margin is narrow. The first dose will be a minimum. I want to see the response before I adjust. Will you trust me?" He looked at the paper in her hand. He looked at her face. He said, "You prepared this morning." "I have been preparing it since you told me in the library that you had not considered it." He was quiet. He said, "You are a very precise person, Miss Thornton." "I find imprecision leads to poor outcomes," she said. "Your hand, please." He held it out. She placed the folded paper in his palm. His fingers closed over it, and she felt the warmth of his hand for a moment, the weight of it, the slight roughness of the skin at the outer edge, before she withdrew. They drove on. The road climbed toward the pass, he said, after 20 minutes, during which she had been watching the color come into the hills. 5 years is a long time to carry something alone. She said, "Yes, it is." He said, "I did not plan for any of this, for any portion of it that involved another person." She turned to look at him. His profile was set against the window, the light falling across it clearly now, and the exhaustion she had seen in the kitchen garden was still there but differently distributed, as though some portion of it had shifted, been put down somewhere, was no longer entirely his to carry. She said, "Does the hand feel different?" He looked at it. He flexed his fingers slowly, and she watched the tremor, still present but quieted, the amplitude of it reduced to something that a glove would entirely conceal. He said, "Yes." "Good," she said. "We will adjust the dosage after a week and see what the response is." He said, "You speak as though this is already decided." She said, "It is, isn't it?" He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, something that had been held back for so long it did not know quite how to come forward, but was making the attempt. He said, very quietly, "I suppose it is." He knew before they had covered 5 miles that they were being followed. He told her in the same way he told her everything, directly, without decoration, as though she were a person who could be trusted with information and who would put it to use rather than simply respond to it. He said, "There is a carriage behind us. It has maintained the same distance since the first village. It has not attempted to close it." She said, "Cruise man, or a hired substitute. He would not come himself." She turned and looked out the back window. The road stretched away behind them into the valley, and at the edge of where it curved out of sight, she could see, small but distinct, the dark shape of a carriage against the pale landscape. She turned back. She said, "How far to the Borrowdale turning?" He looked at her. She said, "There is a track that leaves the main road 6 miles ahead. It crosses the Borrowdale estate and avoids the exposed section near the high ridge. My aunt's family used it in winter. If we take it before we can be seen from behind, anyone following the main road will not know where we have gone." He leaned forward and spoke to his driver. The Borrowdale track was narrow and overhung with bare-branched trees that clicked against the carriage roof as they passed beneath them, and in the open sections, the ground was frozen iron-hard, which meant they moved faster than the conditions might have suggested. Harriet counted the landmarks she remembered from previous journeys. The stone gate with one pillar fallen, the sharp descent past the culvert, the long flat section where the track ran beside a frozen stream that threw back the morning light in flat silver plates. 20 minutes on the track, nothing behind them. Then the track widened at a crossroads, the junction where one branch went north toward the estate house and the other continued toward the Penrith Road. and Dorian told the driver to stop. He said, "Stay in the carriage." She said, "Absolutely not." He looked at her. She held his gaze. He said, "Miss Thornton." "If you tell me it is for my safety," she said, "I will point out that I am the one who knows this track and who can, if necessary, find a way through this junction faster than your driver can, because he has never been here before, and I have." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The left door sticks unless you press the upper panel inward as you turn the handle." She said, "I understand." He got out. The cold took him immediately. She could see it in the set of his shoulders as he crossed the few yards to where the track met the crossroads, standing in the open in full view of whoever came around the bend. He stood very still. He put his right hand in his coat pocket and took it out again, and she saw the tremor had returned, the cold and the tension together. She watched him. She was very aware of her own heartbeat, the regular, unhurried knock of it against her ribs, and she breathed carefully and waited. The following carriage appeared at the track entrance perhaps 4 minutes later. It had found the turn, or guessed it. The broad-shouldered man from the library climbed down and stood at the edge of the track, perhaps 20 feet from Dorian, and they spoke. She could not hear the words. She watched the line of Dorian's back, very straight, not conceding an inch. She watched the other man's posture shift over the course of perhaps 2 minutes, from readiness into something that was not surrender, but was not advance either. She saw Dorian reach into his coat and produce an envelope, which he held without extending. She saw the other man look at it. She saw Dorian say something. She saw the other man take a step back and then another, and then he returned to his carriage. The carriage turned and went back the way it had come. Dorian returned to their carriage. He sat down. He was breathing carefully, the controlled breath of a man managing what his body had done during the last 5 minutes, without his permission. She said, "Are you hurt?" "No." He exhaled. The cold. He held out his right hand. The tremor was pronounced, the most pronounced she had seen it, the fingers shaking with a regularity that was almost rhythmic, a body responding to sustained tension. She had prepared a second measured portion for exactly this contingency. She had packed it separately in the morning, wrapped in a different paper so she would know by touch which was which. She drew it from her pocket and placed it in his hand without ceremony. The tremor slowed. Not immediately. Nothing biological was immediate. But over the next several minutes, as the carriage moved again and the cold gave way gradually to the internal warmth, it quieted to almost nothing. He held his right hand up in the grey morning light and looked at it with an expression she had not yet seen on him. The expression of a man who is seeing something he had stopped believing possible. She said, "What was in the envelope?" He said, "A letter from my solicitor in London, filed 3 weeks ago. The legal proceedings against Crewe are formally entered with the Crown. They cannot be withdrawn, suspended, or interfered with by any private action." He paused. "The evidence Richard preserved, it is in the record now, it cannot be destroyed." She understood. She said, "So following you, following Richard, it accomplishes nothing. It accomplishes nothing that has not already been accomplished." He was still looking at his hand. "He can do what he likes to me now. The record exists." She said, "Then you came to Ashford Hall knowing Crewe's man would be there." A pause. Then, "I suspected Crewe would have someone watching the county." "Yes." "And you wanted a witness," she said slowly. "Someone credible who had seen the man going through your correspondence. Someone who could testify to it, if it became necessary." He was quiet. She said, "Is that why you let me sit beside you at dinner?" The silence stretched between them. The carriage moved on through the pale winter morning, and the hills rose on either side, and the track ahead was clear and open and running toward Penrith. He said at last, "No." She waited. He said, "I let you sit beside me because you crossed a room full of people who had decided I was not worth the risk, and you sat down. You were not performing bravery. You were not attempting to prove something to anyone, including yourself. You simply looked at me and decided I was worth the trouble of crossing a room." He stopped. He looked at his hand, which was steady now, or very nearly. "I had not expected that. I did not know what to do with it." She looked at him, The morning light had fully arrived by now, coming in at an angle through the carriage window, and it lay across his face cleanly and without softening, and what she saw was exactly what she had been seeing since the first evening. A man of considerable precision and considerable pain, managing both simultaneously, and doing it alone because he had decided at some point that alone was the only option. She said, "You do not have to continue doing it alone." He looked at her. His storm blue eyes were very still and very open. He said after a moment, "I'm going to Carlisle. There is business with a solicitor that may take several days." She said, "My aunt's house is 12 miles from Carlisle. She stays through March." He said, "Then perhaps we have some time." She looked out the window. The valley had opened below them, the hills pulling back on either side to reveal a wide sky that was brightening steadily from grey to white to the first pale suggestion of blue. The meadowland was covered in snow that was already softening at the edges, and a river ran through the middle of it, black against white, moving under the winter quiet. She said, "I would like to see the specimen in your brother's garden, when Richard is settled, when all of this is finished." She paused. "I have read that Cumberland has an extraordinary variety of native plants, particularly in the high meadows." He said, "It does." She said, "That is something to look forward to then." He was quiet. Then he said, "Yes," and the word was small and careful and entirely real. The road wound on. The hills held them. The day opened around them like a page not yet written. The legal proceedings against Lord Aldous Crewe concluded the following February, before a panel of 3 Crown-appointed jurists of impeccable reputation. It was not a dramatic conclusion. There was no single revelatory moment, no confrontation built for public memory. There was instead the patient accumulation of 5 years of evidence, arranged by a man who understood that the most reliable way to destroy something corrupt was to build, with great care, the documented record of what it had done. Crewe was stripped of his title by spring. He left England in April, and the world that had organized itself around the threat he represented rearranged quietly in his absence. Richard Halcourt came out of hiding in June. He was thinner than she had imagined from Dorian's measured descriptions of him. Thinner and quieter, a man who had spent years learning to exist in a very small space and had not yet quite unlearned it. But he had Dorian's storm blue eyes, and when he met Harriet in the drawing-room of the townhouse in Grosvenor Square, he looked at her for a moment and said, "He told me about you. In his letters, he said you were not afraid of him." She said, "There was nothing to be afraid of." Richard looked at his brother. Dorian was standing at the window, his back partly to the room, and his expression was the one she had come to know best over the months between Ashford Hall and this day, the expression of a man who has been repeatedly surprised to find himself still here, still in possession of things he had stopped expecting to keep. Richard said quietly, "He is also not afraid of you," in case that was not obvious. She said, "It became obvious fairly quickly." They were married in September, a quiet ceremony, the parish church in Derbyshire, a morning with low autumn light coming through the old windows and the smell of the yew hedge from outside, and her father standing at the end of the aisle with the particular expression of a man whose primary mode of affection had always been silence. He shook Dorian's hand for a very long time before the ceremony. He said nothing. Neither of them needed him to. Clara cried beautifully, with the commitment of a woman who has always known exactly how she looked while weeping. Rosalind, who was engaged herself by then, maintained perfect composure. Richard stood as witness, thinner still but less careful now, beginning, she thought, to learn again how to occupy the full width of his life. Dorian gave Richard the watch before the ceremony in the vestry, with no audience. She did not ask him about this later, and he did not offer to tell her. Some things, she had learned, did not need explanation. They had their own weight and their own privacy, and both of these were worth respecting. The tremor in Dorian's right hand had not gone. It would not go. The damage to the nerves was old and structural, and she had been honest with him about this from the first dose she had calculated in the cold of that winter morning. But it had become, over the months of careful and adjusted treatment, a thing he lived alongside rather than against. He wrote with his left hand. He held cups with his right. He played chess with whichever hand the position required. He had told her once in the kitchen of the Cumberland house that it had stopped surprising him, that there was a quality of peace available in a difficulty you had stopped resisting, and that he had been surprised to discover it was genuine peace and not simply exhaustion. She had pressed her hand over his right one when he said this, without speaking, and felt the tremor against her palm and thought, this is a part of him. This particular texture, this small persistent thing, this too. 2 years after the wedding, in the late summer kitchen garden of Richard's house in Cumberland, opened now to light and visiting and the sounds of an ordinary life, Harriet was documenting a late-blooming growth of meadowsweet when Dorian came to find her. He sat in the grass beside her, which still surprised her sometimes, this willingness to sit in grass. He watched her work, the pressing and the notation, the precise movements of hands that had their own kind of knowledge, and neither of them spoke for a while, because the silence between them had become, over 2 years, one of the most specific and particular things she owned. Their daughter was 11 months old and asleep in the house. The meadowsweet was fully open, and the air carried its smell, sweet and faintly green and medicinal, the smell she had always associated with careful things, with treatments applied correctly, with healing that asked for patience. He said, "Clara has written again." "She always comes in October," Harriet said without looking up. "She cannot help it." "Your aunt has also written. She also cannot help it." He said, "Miss Thornton." She looked up. He had not called her that since they were married, and the use of it now was deliberate, a signal she had learned to recognize his signals, that he was saying something he had thought about before saying. She said, "Yes?" He said, "I had a very specific plan before you for how things would be." He paused. He was looking at the garden, at the meadowsweet and the hills and the afternoon light lying gold and easy across the whole of it. It was a very orderly plan. It involved principally the elimination of risk and the maintenance of solitude. She said, "And?" He turned to look at her. His storm blue eyes were entirely open. No caution, no management, nothing held back. This was the thing she had wanted when she crossed that dining room all those months ago. Not to be looked at precisely, but to be seen, clearly and without arrangement. He said, "This is considerably better." She looked at him. She put down her pen. She took his right hand in both of hers, feeling the tremor quiet slightly against her warmth, and held it the way she held things she did not want to put down. The afternoon went on. The meadowsweet moved in the light breeze. The house held its daughter and its fires, and the weight of 2 people who had kept one very difficult thing safe, and who had found each other quietly and precisely and without flinching inside the keeping of it. Stories told with quiet love.